Hello, uh, I'm Samtu, and this is my mini presentation on the Cold War, how it began, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam War, and how the Cold War ended. So, the Cold War mainly began due to the US policy of containment, which basically stated that communism can only stay in the Soviet Union and spread to no other country. And also with the Berlin Wall and Berlin blockade, where the Soviets, since the Soviets were afraid of Germany attacking them again, they basically blockaded the east and west parts of Germany and also Berlin, the capital of Germany. And the United States used airlifts to get supplies between both parts. So that also contributed to the tensions within the Cold War. Another thing that contributed to Cold War tensions was the arms race, which was which country can build up their military force fastest and most powerful. It mainly began with atomic bombs, since the US already had two and we used two. The Soviets were kind of afraid that we would use one on them. So the war tensions between the Soviet and the United States, that's kind of what began the Cold War. Uh, so it progressed to the point of the Soviets using proxy wars, which basically made which basically means that it's a indirect war. It's a war fought by two superpowers or the two fighting forces, just not like the US stands on one side, Soviets on the other, and they shoot at each other. It's the US stands one side, Soviet gives supplies to Cuba, Cuba shoots at the US, and we try to shoot at the Soviets, even though the Soviets are giving supplies to Cuba and we shoot at the Soviets. So that brings me to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was basically Cuba was facing some issues at the time, and they looked to they looked to America for help first, but America denied them that help. So after looking to America and they were denied, they looked towards the other main superpower of that time, the USSR or the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union supplied them with the help that they requested. So that with that help, Cuba was able to come along and solve the problem that they were having. But there was a effect to it, which was Cuba becoming communist. And as I stated before, that directly went against the US policy of containment, which once again stated that communism cannot spread to any other country. But it did. So the US tried to get rid of the communism in Cuba by doing an invasion into Cuba, but that invasion failed miserably. Fidel Castro, the Cuban communist president slash dictator, absolutely basically annihilated the US's chance to do their invasion. And that invasion was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Yes, I don't really know why it was called Bay of Pigs. Maybe because the water is as pink as a pig. Who knows? Not me. But Cuba, since Cuba became communist, the U.S., through the CIA, tried to get rid of the communism within Cuba, but they failed. And later on, the Soviet Union agreed to take missiles out of Cuba due to constant talking with America. So then they agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba. So Cuba no longer had missiles made by the Soviet Union. I don't know if they still have missiles today, but Cuba no longer had missiles. And that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union, in a nutshell, the Soviet Union supplies missiles to Cuba after Cuba becoming communist. America doesn't want that due to the proximity between the United States and Cuba, and America tries to invade Cuba, and they fail miserably. Now on to the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was somewhat of another proxy war, but not necessarily. It was similar to the Civil War due to the fact that it was North versus South, and both sides wanted their side to win, but the North was communist and the South was capitalist. The reason why neither side could have what they wanted as one Vietnam. North Vietnam, since it was communist, that means that the government controls everything: where you work, how much you get paid, where you live, where you go to school, what you do with the rest of your life. The government controls everything. And a capitalist government, which was what the South was, is a government where you can make your own money. Like, let's say you're a doctor, just for the fun of it. Let's just say that you're a doctor. In a communist government, you would earn the exact same amount of money as, let's say, someone who does not go to school whatsoever. You would earn the exact same amount of money as them. But in a capitalist government, which is what the United States is, you don't see that happening. Doctors would earn more due to the fact that they've had more training, more school, all of that. In a communist government, none of those factors come into play. You just get paid the amount that the government feels like they want to pay you. So that's the main reason why neither North Vietnam nor South Vietnam could be one and compromise differences because their belief systems were like complete opposites. So North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union. South Vietnam was supported by the United States. Within South Vietnam, uh there were some people that were against capitalism, and those people were called Viet Congs. So they would basically be trained in guerrilla tactics. And guerrilla tactics is basically like sneak attack, ambush. You use your environment to your advantage. Like a lion, or maybe even a gorilla. You use your environment to your advantage during a battle. We also used those tactics when we fought in the Revolutionary War. So they used guerrilla tactics to attack South Vietnam, and North Vietnam ended up winning the war, causing all of Vietnam, both North and South, to be unified, which was a goal that both the two different countries wanted, but it was unified under communism instead of capitalism. So that could be like the only war that the US really lost, besides probably the drug war that's currently happening right now. But that's the only major war that the US probably you would consider lost. But that's the Vietnam War. Now on to the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was basically due to the new Soviet Union president, the first president to be popularly elected. Not, I don't know how communist leaders are elected. Well, he was the first president to be actually elected by popular vote instead of like czars who basically take control. So what he ended up doing was creating two new policies to called one was called Perestroika, the other one was called Glasnost. Glasnost means openness in, I think, Russian. I don't really know. But it means openness, and it was basically an attempt to give the Soviets or Soviet people more rights, like the right to be critical of the government, basically freedom of speech, and it also gave the press the right to also be critical of the government just through writing. And so that was one thing. And perestroika, which means reconstruction or restructure, basically was an attempt to better the government. It allowed for people to own private business, like own their own business. That was the time that you could buy a building, create a business out of it, pay whatever you wanted to pay to your workers. So instead of paying it to the government and then the government spreads it out between all people. And it was due to the fact that the government was corrupt, the economy was trash, living situations were also trash. The Soviet Union was trying to reform all. The Soviets were trying to reform the Soviet Union, so they created those two programs to kind of have a lesser version of what America already had. So instead of it being purely communist, it was partial capitalist. And that was one thing that factored into the end of the Cold War. Another thing that factored into the end of the Cold War was the fall of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union split up into, approximately speaking, 15 different countries, and the largest of those countries is by far Russia. Russia. That seems to be like the only country we think about when it comes to the Soviet Union. Russia. And also Russian bears. But back on topic. So they split up into about 15 different countries. Another thing that came with the end of the Cold War was actually, that's all I remember. So yeah, that was the Cold War in a nutshell by Samtu Obiaker, or Samtu Anwar in 18 minutes and 25 seconds. Well, see you later. Bye.